Have you ever sat in silence after giving your whole heart to someone and wondered, almost trembling, if I have loved so much, why do I feel so empty? It is a question that hides inside the quiet hours of the night, in the gap between text messages that never arrive, in the ache of waiting for a gesture that never comes. And it is this question that reveals something most people never want to face, that what they call love might not be love at all. That what they defend as devotion, loyalty, or sacrifice may in truth be something else entirely, a kind of emotional debt. A secret accounting where one person keeps giving while the other barely notices. And if that is the case, then we must ask the great question: are you truly in love, or are you simply emotionally in debt? This distinction matters, not only for your own heart, but for the way love itself has been reshaped in our world.
Yes.
Because we do not live in a vacuum. Our ideas of love are not born pure, untouched by the currents of society. No, our concepts of affection, loyalty, sacrifice are carved by the culture we inhabit, and in the modern era, that culture is steeped in the logic of markets, in the language of contracts, in the relentless belief that effort produces reward. We are trained from childhood to believe that if we work harder, we will earn more, that if we study diligently, success will come, that if we persist long enough, the world will give us what we deserve. And somewhere along the line, this belief seeps into our most intimate spaces. Suddenly, relationships are no longer encounters of spontaneity, of free-flowing connection, but transactions where one invests and waits for a return. Suddenly, what was once love becomes an invisible contract, unspoken but deeply felt, in which every gesture is tallied, every sacrifice recorded, every silence charged with the weight of expectation. Think of the countless stories you have heard or perhaps lived yourself where someone cries out, "I did everything for this person, and still they left me." Beneath that lament is not simply heartbreak, but the logic of debt. It is the belief that giving creates an obligation, that patience should be repaid with loyalty, that suffering should eventually be rewarded with tenderness. And when the reward does not come, what remains is not only grief, but bankruptcy. The heart collapses, not just because love is absent, but because it feels robbed, cheated, defrauded of what it was promised. But here lies the most brutal truth. Love never promised you a return. Love is not a bank, not an economy of sacrifice and reward. And yet millions live as if it were, pouring themselves out like lenders who believe that someday the debtor will pay them back with devotion. Why is this happening? Why does our generation, perhaps more than any before, fall into this pattern of emotional indebtedness? The answer, as Eva Illouz has shown in her work, is structural. It is not simply a quirk of unlucky relationships, nor a sign that a few people are naive or too generous. It is part of a larger shift in how emotions are lived under what she calls emotional capitalism. Just as consumers borrow money to buy into ideals of success and beauty, individuals borrow against their own emotional reserves in the hope of securing the ideal of love. They keep lending patience, affection, forgiveness, as if these were payments on a loan that will someday mature into mutual love. But the cruel logic of this system is that the debt is unpayable. The more one gives, the more trapped one becomes, because admitting the truth that the other will never reciprocate would mean recognizing that all the investment was for nothing, and that recognition is unbearable. So the person continues, not because they are weak, but because they cannot face the collapse of their own belief. The belief that love, like everything else in this neoliberal world, can be earned. And here we see how the modern romance has been transformed into labor. The very language we use betrays it. We talk about working on relationships, about investing in our partners, about putting in the effort. All of this mirrors the corporate world, where success is measured by productivity and returns. But love is not a corporation. It does not follow the principles of efficiency or growth. The tragedy is that people who live in this emotional debt cannot see the difference. They think that the very exhaustion they feel is proof of love, that sacrifice is its own currency, that endurance will one day transform indifference into passion.
Sure.
And so they go on, emptying themselves into relationships that drain them, convinced that to stop would be to betray love itself. Let us stop here and ask a piercing question. when you bend yourself endlessly to accommodate another, when you silence your own needs to avoid conflict, when you give and still receive littler, you truly loving, or are you bargaining? Are you encountering another human being in the mystery of reciprocity, or are you negotiating with a ghost, offering endless payment for a debt no one will ever settle? This is the cruel alchemy of emotional indebtedness. It disguises itself as love. It whispers that to endure is noble, that to give without return is proof of loyalty, that to wait in silence is evidence of patience. But in truth, it is not love at all. It is abandonment of the self, dressed up in the language of devotion. This condition is not born overnight. It is cultivated slowly, like soil prepared for a crop. From a young age, many are taught that love must be earned, that affection is conditional on obedience, that approval is given only when we perform correctly. A child learns that being quiet, pleasing, or sacrificing earns them attention. Later in adolescence, the scripts of romance are delivered through movies, songs, and novels, all whispering the same message. If you try hard enough, you will be noticed. If you wait long enough, you will be chosen. If you sacrifice enough, you will be rewarded. And by the time adulthood arrives, the lesson is already embedded deep within. To love is to pay. To love is to labor. To love is to wait for a return that will eventually come, if only we endure the present drought. And so, when the drought stretches endlessly, when the rain never falls, the individual cannot bear to stop sowing. They would rather continue scattering seeds into barren ground than admit that the field was never fertile. This is the silent tragedy of our age, not the heartbreak of breakups which are painful but visible, but the quiet suffocation of those who remain in relationships that are already dead, unable to leave because they cannot abandon. The idea that all their effort must one day pay off. They stay not out of joy, but out of debt. They remain not because love is alive, but because they cannot accept that love has never been there. And each day their identity erodes a little more, become less of themselves and more of what the other desires, or rather, what they imagine the other desires. They adjust their moods, their words, their silences, all to keep alive the hope of a reciprocity that will never arrive. They become, in the most literal sense, emotional bankers, managing an account that only bleeds red, adding line after line of sacrifices, hoping one day the balance will turn. Imagine a bank that continues to loan money to a client who never pays a cent back. Not only that, but the bank raises the credit limit, tolerates default, and even congratulates itself on being generous. Such a bank would collapse in months. And yet this is how countless people manage their hearts. They extend forgiveness after betrayal, patience after neglect, generosity after indifference. They raise the limit again and again, telling themselves that this is what true love requires. And like the reckless bank, they march steadily toward bankruptcy. But here's the difference. A bank can rebuild its capital through new investments. But an emotionally indebted person risks losing something much harder to recover their sense of self-worth. For each new sacrifice given without return, the silent conclusion grows stronger. Perhaps I am not worth loving unless I give endlessly. Perhaps I am only valuable when I disappear into the other. This is how debt transforms into trauma. The trauma of emotional debt is not the sharp pain of rejection, but the slow erosion of the soul. It is the confusion of believing that love and suffering are inseparable. That if you are hurting, it must mean you are loving. That if you are exhausted, it must mean you are loyal. Over time, the line between affection and pain blurs until they become indistinguishable. The individual no longer even notices the imbalance. They call it compromise, maturity, resilience. They tell themselves they are just being patient, just giving the relationship a chance. But beneath these noble words lies a harsher reality. They are enslaved by the illusion of future reward. They are caught in a hope that keeps them chained to suffering. And hope in this form is not salvation, but captivity. Let us pause again and ask, why is it so hard to break free from this illusion? Why does the emotionally indebted person remain, even when all evidence points to the futility of their efforts? The answer lies in the logic of sunk cost. Economists describe it as the tendency to continue a failing investment, because too much has already been spent, but no one wants to face the loss, so they pour in more resources, hoping to eventually recover. In love, the same dynamic unfolds. The more time, patience, and sacrifice a person has given, the harder it is to admit that none of it will ever bring the return they dreamed of. To walk away would mean accepting that the years, the tears, the compromises were all for nothing. And so they keep paying, sinking deeper into deficit, unable to bear the grief of loss. They confuse endurance with progress, and waiting with loyalty, when in truth, they are simply prolonging their own collapse.
And there comes a moment when the weight of it all can no longer be denied. When the silence between gestures feels louder than the words that are spoken. When the very body of the emotionally indebted person begins to collapse under the strain of carrying a relationship that has long since ceased to exist as a true bond. At first, this collapse is subtle. A little less joy in daily life. A little more anxiety in the quiet hours. A little more fear at every delay in response. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it grows until the entire being of the person is reshaped by the logic of debt. They no longer ask, "Am I happy?" But instead, "Am I doing enough?" They no longer wonder, "Does this person love me?" But rather, "What else can I give to make them stay?" It is a shift so profound that it redefines identity. The lover becomes not a partner but a servant of hope, someone who measures their worth only in terms of what they can sacrifice, someone who confuses exhaustion with intimacy. What is most cruel about this process is that it rarely comes with obvious abuse. The partner who benefits from all this sacrifice may not even intend harm. They may simply drift, accepting care, attention, and loyalty without ever thinking to reciprocate. They may not see themselves as exploiters, yet their passivity allows the imbalance to deepen. In some ways, this is even harder to endure because there is no villain to point to, no dramatic betrayal to name. Instead, the suffering comes in the form of indifference, silence, or neglect, which the indebted person continually rationalizes away. They say, "He's just busy," or "She has her traumas," or "Things will change when the timing is right." The excuses pile up like interest on a loan, making it harder and harder to see the truth. And so the trauma deepens, not with a bang, but with a whisper, not through cruelty, but through the slow starvation of affection. Over time, this creates what can only be described as an internal war. One part of the person knows they deserve more, knows that love should not feel like this, knows that something essential is missing. But another part, louder and more insistent, clings to the belief that leaving would mean failure, that walking away would mean admitting all their sacrifices were in vain. And so, they stay suspended in a kind of limbo, torn between the yearning for freedom and the fear of emptiness. This is the secret torment of emotional indebtedness. It makes the person complicit in their own suffering. They become the ones who silence their doubts, who explain away neglect, who accept crumbs and call them banquets. They protect the illusion at all costs, because to let it go would mean facing the terrifying possibility that love has never truly been there. The consequences are devastating. Anxiety becomes constant, not the sharp panic of a single crisis, but the low, grinding hum of chronic unease. The emotionally indebted person checks their phone obsessively, reading between the lines of messages, measuring the length of silences, assigning meaning to every tiny sign of attention. A single affectionate gesture is magnified into proof that things are improving, while days of distance are swallowed with the excuse that patience is required. In this way, the person lives in a permanent state of vigilance, as though their very survival depends on predicting and controlling the emotions of the other. And in a sense, it does, because they have staked their entire sense of worth on whether or not they can finally earn the love they seek. This is where the trauma solidifies. Over time, the person begins to equate affection with labor, attention with performance, intimacy with suffering. They come to believe, often unconsciously, that love must hurt, that it must cost something, that it is always bound up with endurance and loss. They normalize abandonment by telling themselves it is temporary. They excuse coldness as shyness, indifference as fear of intimacy, distance as proof of independence. Every sign of absence is reinterpreted as a hidden form of presence, every rejection as a challenge to be overcome. And in doing so, they lose touch with reality itself. They begin to live in a fantasy where every wound is just another test of loyalty, every disappointment just another step on the road to eventual recognition. But that recognition never comes. And the longer they wait, the harder it becomes to leave, because the debt has grown too large. They think, I have given too much to walk away now. What they cannot see is that the debt is not real, that it is a trap constructed by their own belief in emotional accounting. Breaking free requires the most brutal of recognitions, that the love they seek does not exist in this relationship, that it never has, and that no amount of sacrifice will conjure it into being. This recognition is devastating. It feels like a death, because in a sense, it is the death of a fantasy, the collapse of a dream. But it is also the beginning of liberation, for only when the illusion is shattered can the person reclaim their own life. They must come to see that what they have been giving was never love in the truest sense, but rather a desperate attempt to purchase love through endurance. They must realize that real love is not earned, not bargained for, not demanded as payment for loyalty. Real love flows freely, without debt, without accounting, without the exhaustion of endless negotiation. And if it is not present, no amount of effort will create it. This realization does not come. It requires a mourning, not just for the relationship itself, but for the years of sacrifice that can never be recovered. It requires facing the unbearable thought that all the giving, all the patience, all the hope was never truly seen or valued. It requires stepping into the emptiness that has been avoided for so long and daring to live without the illusion of reciprocity. But in that emptiness lies the possibility of rebirth. For the first time, the person can begin to ask not, what must I give to be loved, but what kind of love do I deserve? They can begin to see that their worth was never dependent on the approval of another, that their dignity was never measured by their ability to endure, that their identity is not reducible to the role of emotional banker. They can learn that leaving does not mean losing love. It means refusing to participate in a counterfeit version of it. The journey out of emotional debt is neither quick nor easy. It is not a matter of simply deciding to walk away, for the patterns are deeply ingrained. Even after leaving, the person may find themselves drawn back to the same dynamics, offering too much, waiting too long, confusing silence for intimacy. The ghost of the old logic lingers, whispering that perhaps this time it will be different, that perhaps one more sacrifice will finally tip the scales. But with time and self-knowledge, the grip of the illusion weakens. Each recognition of disinterest becomes clearer, each act of neglect harder to excuse, each disappointment less surprising. Slowly, the person begins to reclaim their strength. Not the performative strength of blind resilience, but the deeper strength of self-knowledge. They learn to see love not as a transaction, but as an exchange of presence, not as a debt, but as a gift. Not as endurance, but as connection. And in this recognition lies the beginning of freedom. Because the truth is harsh, but also liberating. No one owes you love, and you owe no one love in return. Love cannot be demanded or purchased. It cannot be forced through sacrifice or conjured through patience. It either exists or it does not. And if it does not, then all the waiting in the world will not bring it forth. To accept this truth is to step out of the logic of emotional capitalism, to refuse the cruel arithmetic that measures affection in terms of effort and return. It is to recognize that love, when it is real, feels light, even when it is demanding, joyful, even when it requires effort, alive, even in the face of difficulty. And if what you feel instead is exhaustion, emptiness, and endless waiting, then it is not love. It is debt, and you are free to let it go.